We are continuing our series in the book of Ruth, and last week I gave you the spoiler or the warning, depending on how you look at it, that today especially was going to feel a lot like a Hallmark movie. In fact, really, the whole book of Ruth feels a lot like a Hallmark movie. Now, I don't know if you like those kinds of movies or not. Last week after church, one of my kids asked me, "Dad, what's a Hallmark movie?" Well, you might be familiar. In essence, it usually involves a woman who travels home for the holidays to her small town and meets someone and they fall in love happily ever after. It's those romantic kind of movies. Maybe you like them, maybe you don't. Let's just try to imagine for a moment. How would you know if you were stuck in a Hallmark movie? Right? What would be some telltale signs? Because they're all kind of the same. I found these on the internet. These aren't original with me. But the first way you would know you were stuck in a Hallmark movie is that you can't seem to get away from the 5 o'clock shadow guy. Right? You know the guy, the 5 o'clock shadow guy. He's got this perfect stubble that makes him look just the right amount of rugged, never unkempt. He wears flannels. He drives an old pickup truck. He's never from the big city. It's always from a small town. For work, he does something with his hands that's praiseworthy. And in his spare time, of course, he contributes to the community by building birdhouses for homeless birds or helping old ladies put up their Christmas trees. He's always around, always offering a helping hand, always reminding you with just his mere presence that your current boyfriend is a selfish scumbag who's too ambitious and doesn't support your dreams. That would be one of the ways you would know you're stuck in a Hallmark movie. What's another way? Well, you're forced to spend the holiday season in a small town, right? I mean, whether you grew up there and are visiting family or your usually reliable car somehow breaks down, as soon as you cross that small town border, you're stuck there for Christmas. The town is always covered in snow. It's decorated so well it rivals Whoville. There's no chain stores or apartment complexes. Everybody lives in log cabins or cottages, which are mostly heated by wood-fired stoves. Nobody watches television unless it's to watch the Frosty the Snowman or other Christmas classics. The place to be in town is Main Street, a street filled with quaint boutiques and other shops, none of which employ more than 3 people usually. Another one that I read online said, you know you're stuck in a Hallmark movie because your family business is failing. When you return to your small town for the holidays, you learn that against all odds, your family's 100-year mercantile business, which basically sells barrels of oats to the townsfolk, is somehow failing. Your parents are too old and you either have no siblings or they're completely unsuitable to take over the family business. You're the only one that can take on that burden and save the family business from being bought by Amazon and turned into a parking lot at the expense of your career and the life that you've built for yourself in the city. That'd be another way you knew you were stuck in a Hallmark movie. The fourth and final way I'll give you is that you react to any misunderstanding by planning to skip town and join a nunnery. Inevitably you're going to overhear a conversation out of context that makes you believe wholeheartedly that 5 o'clock shadow guy who has spent the whole movie fixing your fences and shoveling your driveway is in love with someone else. The someone else in question is either a catty, mean girl or someone who is so sweet and genuine that you are convinced they're an angel sent from heaven who you can never compete with. Instead of using your critical thinking skills or, asking 5 o'clock shadow guy, your reaction is to throw all your stuff in your car and head for the nearest nunnery. But don't worry, before you manage to leave town, 5 o'clock shadow guy will find you and clear up the misunderstanding before kissing you while it snows atmospherically behind you. Those are some telltale signs you're stuck in a Hallmark movie. Those are some of the characters. Who are the characters in our version of this Hallmark movie here in the book of Ruth? Let's transition now, if we can. We've got 3 so far. They're the main characters. Naomi. She's gone through tremendous heartache and loss. She feels like God is against her. She went away pleasant. She came back grieving and bitter. We've got the character of Ruth, the foreigner from the land of Moab. She's a hard worker. She cares for Naomi. She finds tremendous favor in the fields of this man named Boaz. And that's our third character, Boaz. He's a man of noble character, literally a mighty man of valor. Last week we looked at that he talked the talk and he walked the walk. He has the potential to be a family redeemer. We're halfway through the book now, and we reach the turning point of the story. We left off at the end of chapter 2, where we read Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And there's this tension now of, well, what's going to happen next if harvest season is over? And so our Hallmark movie today has 9 scenes, and we're going to move pretty quickly through all of them. We're going to read through this book. The first scene that we come across, the introduction to our movie, as it were, the plan. That's scene number 1. Here we go, Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, shouldn't I find rest for you so that you will be taken care of?" Now, isn't Boaz our relative? Again, hinting at that family redeemer. Haven't you been working with his female servants? This evening he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfumed oil, and wear your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place where he's lying. Go in and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do. Naomi, the mother-in-law, has got a plan. Now, look, we don't know how much time has passed, really kind of between chapters 2 and 3, at least probably a few months, just because of the different harvesting seasons. But for the second time, Naomi persists in finding rest and security for Ruth through marriage. That's what the phrase when Naomi said, "Shouldn't I find rest for you?" Another translation might read, "Should I find a home for you?" She's talking about finding Ruth a husband, and Naomi points out again that Boaz can serve as their family redeemer. Now, we talked about this family redeemer last week, but as a reminder, a kinsman redeemer would be another way to say it. It meant that this person was a relative who could act as a redeemer of property and persons to care for their well-being. If Naomi had had another son, under the law, he would step forward and marry Ruth to carry on the family line. In this case, because Boaz was a relative from Naomi's deceased husband's family, he could act as a brother-in-law if he was willing to do so. And so then Naomi gives some instructions to Ruth that in today's culture probably seem really weird, right? Just odd. At least that last part does. I mean, Naomi says, clean up, put on some of that smelly stuff, get dressed up. That all makes sense. But this part about going down at night, don't tell anybody you're there, watch where he goes to sleep, and then uncover his feet and lay down at them, it kind of has us just kind of scratching our heads. Huh? What is she supposed to do? So let's try to take a step back and understand culturally what's going on here, okay? So the threshing floor, where this was to take place, this was a spot where the Israelites would take their grain after the harvest. They would thresh the grain, they would beat out the grain from the stalks, or maybe it was walked over by oxen. Then in the winnowing of the grain, it was thrown up into the air. The wind would carry away the chaff, and the grain would fall back down to the threshing floor. From there, it was put into a pile and then sold or stored for later use. And you can imagine that this threshing and winnowing the grain, this time, was a great occasion for celebrating and rejoicing. Right here is all of their hard work coming to fruition. And everybody would take turns using the threshing floor. And so Naomi knew that Boaz was going to be there that night using the threshing floor and that he was going to be in a good mood. So Naomi is taking a huge gamble here by sending Ruth. How is Boaz going to respond? So that's scene number 1. Scene number 2, coming up next in our movie, the action. Verse 5. So Ruth said to her, "I will do everything you say." She went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had charged her to do. After Boaz ate, drank, and was in good spirits, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley. And she came secretly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. So Ruth agrees, goes out, does exactly what her mother-in-law had instructed her to do. But still, this uncovering the feet thing, what is that about? Well, a lot of that has been lost over time. It's kind of hard to know. Basically seems to be some sort of ceremonial act that was, some sort of proposal. It allowed Ruth to indicate to Boaz her desire for him to act as their family redeemer. Probably one commentator says that this scene took place in the dark so that Boaz had the opportunity to reject the proposal without the whole town knowing about it. And verse 7 says she came secretly. Now, for a variety of reasons, some interpret this action as some sort of immoral or indecent proposal by Ruth, but I don't think that's what's happening here. There's a couple of reasons, but primarily because Naomi and Ruth and Boaz specifically are all always pictured and portrayed as noble and honorable and virtuous, people of high character. But nonetheless, Ruth goes in, she does what she's supposed to do, and now how will Boaz respond? Think of all the ways that this could go wrong, right? A woman proposing to a man, younger proposing to older, a field worker proposing to the field owner, a Moabite foreigner to a Bethlehem Israelite. But Naomi has faith that this will work, and Ruth does as instructed. What does Boaz do? That takes us to scene 3, the response. Here's what happens. Verse 8. At midnight, Boaz was startled. He turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. So he asked, "Who are you?" "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied. "Take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer." Then he said, "May the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer." Boaz's reaction here, right, if you can just picture that, it's like he's startled. He wakes up and there's this strange woman, he doesn't realize who it is right away, laying at his feet. He's startled by that. That makes sense, right? Then he hears Ruth's proposal and he responds in a positive way. He references her kindness. That's the same word, the same kindness that we've talked about in each of the last 2 weeks. And it's here in this moment in our Hallmark movie that the sun is shining, figuratively speaking, the birds are chirping, love is in the air. What can go wrong, right? But then, like there will be in any good Hallmark movie, there's a twist. Scene 4 is called The Twist. Here's what happens. Back to verse 12. "Yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but," oh man, hearts drop everywhere, "but there is a redeemer closer than I am. Stay here tonight. And in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now, lie down until morning." Whoa, this twist came out of nowhere. What? There's another family redeemer closer in the line of succession, if you will, closer than Boaz? Where did this guy come from? Right? Boaz says, "Listen, it's going to be okay. I'll talk to him. And if he wants to redeem you, that's good. I'll let him do it. But if he doesn't, I will." And then he basically tells her, just go back to sleep, right? And I'm guessing probably nobody slept much that night, right? Like, if that's going through your mind, you're probably not getting any more rest. Whew, did not see this twist coming. Early the next morning, they go their separate ways when all you can do now is wait. That's what scene 5 is called, the waiting. Here's what happens, verse 14. "So she lay down at his feet until morning, but got up while it was still dark. Then Boaz said, 'Don't let it be known that a woman came down to the threshing floor.' And he told Ruth, 'Bring the shawl you're wearing and hold it out.' And when she held it out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into the town. She went to her mother-in-law, Naomi, who asked her, 'What happened, my daughter?' Then Ruth told her everything the man had done for her. She said, 'He gave me these 6 measures of barley because he said, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.' Naomi said, 'My daughter, wait until you find out how things go, for he won't rest unless he resolves this today.'" So Ruth comes back, gives Naomi this full report, and so we see all three players in this story filling some sort of role, right? Naomi comes up with a well thought out plan. She gives it to Ruth and waits for the report. Ruth follows the plan, makes the proposal to Boaz, and now she's waiting. Boaz receives the proposal. He responds in a positive way. One way or another, this is going to be taken care of, and the ball is now in his court. Boy, at least in our culture nowadays, we don't see proposals a lot like this anymore, do we? This story has made me think of, when I proposed to my wife, Carrie. And it was at my grandparents' farm in Iowa. We were kind of having a family reunion, and we were doing some camping. Everybody was out kind of in one of my grandpa's yards. We had some tents out there. We were camping in different tents and things. And so I just tried to picture what this would have been like, if I had been sleeping in a tent and suddenly I woke up because my feet were getting cold, and Carrie's just sitting there by my feet, and I'm supposed to know what that means in some way, and then if my response to her would have been, well, listen, I appreciate the question. I'll just tell you, somebody's going to marry you. It might be me. It might be this other guy. Either way, sure, the answer to your question is yes. I don't know how Carrie would have viewed that. Our proposal was a little bit more traditional. It involved this Pooh Bear right here. Carrie's favorite character is Winnie the Pooh. And so our proposal was down beside a creek. I had hid the ring in his battery compartment here. So I had given this to Carrie just as a gift. And he talks, if he has batteries in him, but she couldn't get him to work. So we said, well, let's check the batteries. And she opened it up in the battery compartment, and the ring was there. And the rest, as they say, is history. But again, I tried to think about that, like if the roles had been reversed and I had asked her to marry me, and she said, well, either I will or this other person will. Either way, somebody will marry you. Well, I don't know how I would feel about that. This is just a crazy story. But that brings us to scene 6, the twist, part 2. Okay, the ball's in Boaz's court. Here's what happens. Verse 1, now we're in chapter 4. Boaz went to the gate of the town, and he sat down there. Soon the family redeemer Boaz that had spoken about came by. Boaz said, come over here and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Well, that guy's life's about ready to change. He doesn't know it yet. Then Boaz took 10 men of the town's elders and said, sit here. And they sat down. He said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has returned from the territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should inform you. Buy it back in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you want to redeem it, do it. But if you do not want to redeem it, tell me so that I will know, because there isn't anyone other than you to redeem it, and I am next after you. I want to redeem it, he answered. So here we see how the process of the family redeemer plays out. Boaz gathers the redeemer, who is a closer relative than he is. He also gathers 10 of the town elders as witnesses. And he says, Naomi has this land, she needs to sell it. As a relative of Elimelech, you have the right of first refusal, basically. And the guy says, yes, I want it. I'll act as the family redeemer. And movie watchers everywhere, their hearts are crushed. No, it's not supposed to go this guy. It's supposed to be Boaz. Boaz is the one. But this guy says, yeah, I want to buy it. That's the order that they have to go in. Boaz is like, okay, great. But there's one more thing. That's scene 7, the twist undone, is what I called it. Verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from Naomi, you will acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the deceased man, to perpetuate the man's name on his property. The Redeemer replied, I can't redeem it myself, or I will ruin my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption, because I can't redeem it. Somehow, in the death of Elimelech, the property had passed to Mahlon. That was Ruth's deceased husband. And so Ruth is included in the redemption responsibility. And this other Redeemer, who, interestingly enough, we never learn his name, he does a 180, right? He goes from, yeah, I want to buy it, to, well, I can't buy it. I'll ruin my own inheritance. And that means Boaz is next in line, and movie watchers everywhere are rejoicing, right? Well, what changed? What caused that guy to do 180? Commentators offer a few ideas about this. Maybe he was too poor to support both more land and a wife. Maybe he didn't want to marry a Moabite foreigner. A more likely reason would be that once he learned that Ruth was involved, he would probably have a son as a result of this marriage. That son would eventually inherit not only this property, but part of the Redeemer's property as well. And if it had just been Naomi, it wouldn't have mattered because Naomi was past childbearing years. Regardless, he changed his mind. And that sets the stage for Boaz. And all that is left now is to sign the papers and make it official. Scene 8, the agreement. Verse 7. At an earlier period in Israel, a man removed his sandal and gave it to the other party in order to make any matter legally binding concerning the right of redemption or the exchange of property. This was the method of legally binding a transaction in Israel. So the Redeemer removed his sandal and said to Boaz, "Buy back the property yourself." So by signed papers, I mean, give the other guy your sandal. That's kind of odd, right? I mean, it's interesting that the act of giving over the sandal was something that others were going to witness. They were going to remember that, and it symbolized Boaz's right to walk on the land as his property. And what's interesting, did you catch it? Just kind of as a side note here, when the book of Ruth was written, this act of passing over a sandal had actually become obsolete already back then. Verse 7 is really the author's commentary, kind of cluing in his readers, why would you pass over a sandal? He kind of explains that and then says that's what Boaz did. But good news, the wedding bells are ringing again. That brings us to scene number 9, verse 9. Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth, the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property, so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today." All the people who were at the city gate, including the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. May you be powerful in Ephrathah and your name well known in Bethlehem. May your house become like the house of Perez, the son Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman." So that's it. It's over, right? Boaz and Ruth are getting married. We find out in the next verse that they have a son. But the credits on this movie are basically rolling at this point. And man, what a whirlwind of 24 hours. Right? We don't know the exact time of day that Naomi initially gave the plan to Ruth, or what time the next day Boaz is talking to the elder council and this other potential redeemer. But it seems like this could have all happened within 24 hours from start to finish. Like, that's crazy. So as we look at this movie in the book of Ruth, this Hallmark movie, if you will, maybe the first one, what's the application? Right? Is the application here that if you're looking for a mate, then you should find someone, uncover their feet, lay down next to them? No, I don't think that's it. Is it that everything always just works out nice in the end? And we can always put a bow on every story like there is on this one? I don't think that's it either. Let's go back to this Hallmark movie thing. There's generally two groups of people when it comes to these movies, right? Either you love them because you enjoy just a good love story where there's happily ever after and she falls in love with the right one and he does what he's supposed to do and it all works out in the end. Or you hate these kind of movies because nothing ever quite works out just like that. Right? It's always too good to be true. It's not realistic. You don't have time for that. Whether you love them or hate them, though, at the end of the day, a Hallmark movie is just that. It's a movie. It's not real. It doesn't impact you. It doesn't really have any effect on your day, the way things are going to turn out in your life. And you might have a favorite movie or two like that, but you're probably not invested in the story. Or by that I mean, again, even if it doesn't quite turn out the way you think it should turn out, yeah, it's kind of a bummer, but it doesn't change what actually happens in your life. But what about this story? Why should we care about Naomi and Boaz and Ruth? Why is this story, why is it even in the Bible? Of all the stories that could have been put in here, why does this story matter? What's else is interesting to think about is that if this book, if this was an actual movie script, right, and all we knew was what was written here, do you realize that God isn't even really a major character in this story? I mean, yes, God is mentioned in a request or a promise, a couple times, may the Lord grant you rest, or may the Lord bless you. And again, God is mentioned as inflicting hardship. The Lord's hand turned against me, Naomi said. And next week we'll read that God granted conception to Ruth to allow her to have a son. But other than that, he's not really mentioned here. There's no direct conversations with God. There's no direct commands from God here. So again, why is this story in the Bible? And why should you care? Well, it all has to do with that son that Ruth and Boaz have. His name was Obed. And whether you know it or not, Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and Obed had a direct impact on your life. I'll explain why this is true and why the book of Ruth should matter to you next week. I hope you'll come back and join us and see how all of this ties together. In the meantime, I'm praying for you. Thanks for being with us this week. If there's something specific that we can pray for, please feel free to reach out to us, send us an email, give us a phone call. We will be honored to pray on your behalf. I'm praying as you live deployed in your communities to the people around you, showing God's love to them in the same way that you have received God's love. We'll see you next week. Panama Baptist Church, you are deployed.